Hedonism is a school of philosophy from the Socratic and Hellenistic periods of ancient Greece, which holds that pleasure is the most important pursuit of mankind and that we should always act so as to maximize our own pleasure. Even though there are multiple less extreme variants to this lifestyle, today we will solely focus on hedonism, a synonym of decadence and debauchery as a means of finding long-term happiness. Within my video project, I will argue why hedonism is a destructive lifestyle for those who follow it, whether this is done intentionally or by coincidence, as it only leads to a temporary sense of fulfillment and not long-term happiness. In 1890, the Irish poet Oscar Wilde published The Picture of Dorian Gray, a Gothic and philosophical novel which tells the story of a young man who becomes corrupted by immoral influences and the belief of moral immunity. Already known as a controversial personality, Oscar Wilde shows us what human beings can become when our only sole objective is to yield into temptation and the pleasures of lives as a means of finding lifetime fulfillment. Against Nature portrays a similar theme, illustrating the story of Descent, a decadent alien aristocrat who retreats to an isolated villa where he indulges his taste for luxury and excess. Few people have had as much of an influence in the realm of moral philosophy and hedonism as Henry Sidgwick. In 1874, the British philosopher published The Methods of Ethics, where he poses a different, more radical concern towards the notion of happiness and the pleasure experience under a life of hedonism. Labeling his concern under the label The Paradox of Hedonism, Sidgwick questions the validity of hedonism as a means of finding happiness and even pleasure itself. Sidgwick writes, "The impulse towards pleasure can be self-defeating. We fail to attain pleasures if we deliberately seek them." Similarly, he writes, "Happiness cannot be pursued, it must ensue, and it only does so as an unintended side effect of one's personal dedication to a greater cause than oneself, or as the byproduct of one surrendering to a person other than oneself." For Sidgwick, if you seek pleasure or happiness for the sole purpose of achieving it for yourself, you will fail. Instead, you must pursue other goals that will bring you happiness or pleasure as an unwarranted byproduct of your actions. In Chapter 1, Huysmans presents Descent suffering from this self-defeating malady through one of the most common means of trying to find pleasure: promiscuity. No matter what he tried, he was oppressed by an overpowering sense of ennui. He grew desperate and resorted to the dangerous caresses of virtuoso professionals. In the same way that prepubescent girls hanker after tainted or revolting food, he began to dream of, then to indulge in, bizarre sexual practices and deviant pleasures. This marked the end, as though satisfied at having exhausted every possibility, as though worn out with the strain, his senses were overpowered by inertia, and impotence was close at hand. When his sanity returned, he found himself alone, sober, abominably tired, craving an end that the cowardice of his body prevented his attaining. For Huysmans, trying to find pleasure solely by physical means is simply self-defeating, as the sense becomes common ground and it leaves the pupil impotent to the experience. Descent's unquenchable need to constantly seek pleasure of various sorts ultimately makes his actions futile, and in the need to look for more extreme maladies. Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy states, "Many pleasures cannot possibly be constructed as constitutive of happiness. In this sense, hedonism falls under the consequence that pleasure might fade with time, leaving the pleasure seeker unsatisfied and with the urge for ever stronger stimuli." This could involve increasingly hazardous behavior and also lead inevitably to disappointment because they experience blunt sensitivity, the result for the hedonist being one of emptiness. While not addressing this concern directly, Aristotle commented on the futility of pursuing pleasure, human beings being like actors who bring about consequences, and among this is pleasure. Aristotle then argues as follows: how then is it that no one is continuously pleased? Is it that we grow weary? Certainly, all human things are incapable of continuous activity. Therefore, pleasure is also not continuous, for it accompanies activity. Sooner or later, finite beings will be unable to acquire and expand the resources necessary to maintain their sole goal of pleasure. In chapter 16, Oscar Wilde writes, "To cure the soul by means of the senses, and the senses by means of the soul." Yes, that was the secret. He had often tried it and would try it now. There were opium dens where one could buy oblivion, dens of horror where the memory of old scenes could be destroyed by the madness of scenes that were new. Dorian Gray is mistaken in his attempt to cure the soul by means of the senses, that is, by outside stimulants. The quote, "dens of scenes could be destroyed by the madness of scenes now," portray Gray's attempt at abating his own unhappiness by partaking in other corrupt actions. A similar theme is portrayed where Huysman writes, "The confused medley of meditation on art and literature in which he had indulged since his isolation as a dam to bar the current of old memories, he had been rudely swept away, and the onrushing, irresistible wave crashed into the present and future, submerging everything beneath the blanket of the past, filling his mind with an immensity of sorrow on whose surface floated, like futile wreckage, absurd trifles and dull episodes of life." For Huysman and Oscar Wilde, attempting to find short-term pleasures to fulfill one's emptiness is futile, as it leaves the individual needing greater, more extreme forms of unwarranted distractions. While using their wealth to manipulate daily living works for a little while, both Dorian and de Cézanne are ultimately left empty once again, searching for different, more extreme ways of temporary distraction, unable to find long-term happiness through a means of the senses. Merely to have a good time in the present moment does not provide a basis for a life of well-being. There are many other important factors, for example, a sense of purpose and meaning, positive relationships, regular periods of flow, a positive thinking style, and a sense of accomplishment and achievement. A life based on flow, altruism, and self-development becomes rich with meaning and fulfillment. A life of meaning often means sacrifice of immediate pleasures and of emotional comfort. You feel a higher sort of emotional satisfaction when your life has meaning. The aforementioned sense of fulfillment, which is what we should appropriately call happiness and aim for, even if there are also hardships or even suffering. But making feeling good the goal and metric is not how you find life meaning, nor how you achieve long-term fulfillment.